Okay, so picture this. Your job, everything you work for, but it's being done by a robot.
And not just any robot.
Right, not just any robot. One that's, well, smarter than you. A little creepy, right?
Yeah, it can be a bit unsettling when you really think about it.
That's exactly the kind of future we're going to unpack today. We're diving into some new research on something called the occupational singularity.
And it's not some far-off science fiction scenario either. What we're looking at are very real, measurable changes in the types of jobs that technology creates and the ones it eliminates, and what those changes mean for all of us really soon.
So how does this research even begin to explain such a massive shift?
Well, they use this interesting analogy comparing the entire economy to a city, but not just any city one with two very distinct neighborhoods.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these neighborhoods?
So on one side of town, you've got what they call the legacy sector. This is where you find those jobs that have been around forever. Think construction, teaching, healthcare, those kinds of things. Technology definitely plays a role, but it hasn't fundamentally changed what it takes to do those jobs.
Okay, so you're saying that at their core, the skills needed for those legacy jobs, they're still fundamentally human skills.
Exactly.
Makes sense. So what about the other side of town?
Now that's where things get really interesting. This is the cybernetics sector, and it's all about jobs that are increasingly done by computers, AI algorithms making decisions, finding patterns, often much faster and more accurately than any human ever could.
And that's happening everywhere, right? I mean, we all see it with coding and data, but this research argues it's going even further into finance design.
Absolutely. And at the heart of it all is what they call cognitive technology, which I'll admit sounds a bit like something straight out of Star Trek.
It does sound futuristic. So what does that even mean? Cognitive technology.
Well, it's essentially about any technology that replicates or even surpasses what we used to think of as uniquely human mental abilities. Things like learning, problem solving, making decisions, those higher level cognitive functions, and singularity. Well, that refers to the point where these technologies become so incredibly advanced, so capable, that they create this massive disruption across all sectors, not just those cybernetic ones.
And that's what has everyone a little on edge, right? I mean, this research makes some pretty bold claims, like, for example, that as these cybernetic fields advance, the average number of hours we all work, it might actually go down.
Which sounds nice on the surface, doesn't it?
I'm not complaining. It does sound pretty appealing, I have to say. Like we're all headed towards some kind of utopia where robots handle all the work and we've got all this newfound leisure time.
Yeah, who wouldn't want that? But the reality, like most things, it's a bit more complicated. For example, this whole idea of a society with more leisure time.
Yeah.
Well, it might not be about leisure at all. It might be about displacement.
Displacement. Okay, so now we're talking about jobs actually disappearing.
Exactly. Think about it. You've got these technologies evolving at an incredible pace. What the research argues is that our skills, even those really specialized skills, they could become obsolete. And a lot faster than we're able to learn new ones.
And that's where this occupational singularity, as they call it, starts to feel a little too real.
Right. Exactly. Because if your skills are no longer needed, you're faced with some pretty tough choices. Compete for lower paying jobs, jobs with way less security, or maybe you step out of the workforce altogether. Either way, the impact is huge. Not just for individuals, for all of us. We're talking about potentially increasing income inequality, maybe even social unrest.
It's like a domino effect almost.
It is, really. And the thing is, there are already signs, real-world trends that could be pointing to these shifts. For example, in the US, there's been this pretty significant decline in the number of hours worked, especially by men. We're talking those in the 25 to 54 age bracket. And this trend, it goes back as far as the 1990s.
So you're saying this could be an early indicator of what's to come, that maybe those jobs, they're already starting to disappear.
It's a possibility, and this research certainly doesn't rule it out. Because if we don't start thinking now about how we manage this transition to a workforce that's increasingly reliant on these advanced technologies, well, we risk a future where a good portion of the population, they simply get left behind.
Because their skills, those skills they worked so hard to develop, are suddenly irrelevant.
It's a tough reality, but one we need to start preparing for now.
It makes you wonder then, if we're talking about potentially massive shifts in the job market, millions of people possibly being left behind, who's actually benefiting from all of this? Somebody's got to be coming out ahead.
That's the big question. And this research doesn't shy away from it. In fact, they highlight a trend that I bet you've noticed too. Take a look at those lists they put out, the richest people in the world. Over the last few decades, who's at the top? It's the tech giants, isn't it? The same ones pushing these technological advancements, the cyber entrepreneurs, as the research calls
Well,
them.
yeah, you're right. And I was just reading something the other day. Some founder of an AI company just became the wealthiest person on the planet. So yeah, I see the connection. But is it just a coincidence that the people who create these technologies are also the ones profiting the most from them?
It's a great question. And I think this research would argue that no, it's not a coincidence, not at all. It's about understanding the dynamics at play here. Remember those cognitive technologies we were talking about? Well, these entrepreneurs, they own the companies developing them, deploying them at scale. They own the algorithms, the platforms, even the robots, which means they're in the perfect position to reap the biggest rewards from automation.
Because if you can replace a huge chunk of your workforce with AI or robots, you're cutting out a lot of costs.
Exactly. No more payroll, no benefits to worry about, no more training programs. Those are huge expenses. And it creates this, well, it could be a problematic cycle. The more these entrepreneurs automate, the more their wealth grows. And that gives them even more power to influence the direction of the future of work, which, of course, shapes the entire economy.
It's this feedback loop where the people who benefit the most from the technology are also the ones with the most control over its development and implementation.
Precisely. And this research suggests that it's this very dynamic that could be driving the growing income inequality we're seeing everywhere.
It's like the system is set up to benefit those who are already ahead.
In a way, yes.
You know, it's funny because this whole idea that technology makes us more productive, it's always felt a little off to me. Like, sure, we've got our smartphones and laptops and these amazing gadgets, but do any of us actually feel more productive?
You're not alone. A lot of people feel that way. It's called the productivity paradox. Essentially, it's that gap between all these undeniable advancements in technology and the actual output, the productivity we see in the economy as a whole.
So it's not just me then. There's a name for this feeling. The technology really hasn't made our work lives all that much easier.
Not at all. And it's a real phenomenon. But how can that be? How can we have all this incredible technology, all this automation, and still find ourselves grappling with this productivity paradox?
Yeah, that's what I don't get.
Well, what this research suggests is that maybe the problem isn't the technology itself. Maybe it's how we're measuring productivity. Our traditional methods, they might be missing something crucial that's happening, particularly in this rapidly growing cybernetics sector we talked about.
Okay, I need an example. What do you mean by that?
Sure. Think about the semiconductor industry. That's a massive part of this whole cybernetics sector. Look at the leaps in computing power just over the past few decades. It's mind-boggling. That tiny device you're using to record this very podcast, it's more powerful than the computers that put people on the moon.
It's crazy when you think about it like that.
It is. And the productivity gains in an industry like that, they're off the charts.
That makes sense. So are you saying that the problem is that these productivity gains aren't being evenly distributed?
You're getting it. It's not that technology isn't making us more productive. It's that those productivity gains, they're not being shared equally across different sectors of the economy.
It's like some industries are reaping all the benefits.
Exactly. And that's one of the most important takeaways from this research. This occupational singularity, it's not just about how many jobs are created or lost. It's about how those jobs are distributed, who benefits the most, and more importantly, who's at the greatest risk of being left behind.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think it's safe to say that this occupational singularity, it's not just some abstract idea. It has the potential to completely change how we think about work. But let's be real, we can't just hit pause on technological progress, can we?
No, we can't. And this research isn't suggesting that we should. It's not about stopping progress.
So what can we do? I mean, if we're heading towards this future where technology is constantly reshaping the workforce, how do we make sure that people are prepared? How do they not just survive this, but actually thrive?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's a big one. But the good news is it's not about trying to hold back the tide. This research really stresses the importance of adaptability, of committing to this idea of lifelong learning.
So you're talking about constantly updating your skills, learning new things throughout your entire career.
Exactly, because the skills that are in high demand today, they might be completely obsolete a few years down the line. So it's about cultivating this mindset, this willingness to learn and adapt as the job market changes around you.
That makes sense. But on a practical level, it seems like this requires a much bigger conversation. I mean, it's one thing to say everyone should be constantly learning new skills, but it's another to actually provide those opportunities.
Absolutely. This isn't just about individuals taking responsibility. It's about creating a society that actually supports that kind of lifelong learning. We're talking about education systems that are designed to equip people for a work world that's constantly changing, a world where automation and AI are playing an increasingly central role.
And maybe it even requires us to rethink some of our basic economic assumptions, doesn't it? Like if a large portion of the workforce really is displaced by automation, how do we ensure that everyone benefits from those gains in productivity?
It's a critical question, and this research, it doesn't shy away from those potentially radical solutions, things like universal basic income, for example, or completely new models for distributing wealth. The key takeaway is that we can't just sit back and hope for the best. We need to be proactive.
So we've talked about the economic implications, about the importance of adaptability and lifelong learning. But what about the human side of all of this? This research, it uses this phrase, occupational meaning, which I found really interesting.
It's an important concept, especially in this context.
Because if technology is taking over more and more tasks, even those complex ones, what does that mean for our sense of purpose? That fulfillment we get from our work. If a robot can do your job, and maybe even do it better, where does that leave you?
Those are big questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But it's something we all need to grapple with as we move forward.
It's a lot to consider.
It really is. If our jobs are going to be radically different in the future, maybe we need to rethink what it even means to find meaning in our work. Maybe it's about focusing on those uniquely human skills, the things technology can't replicate, things like creativity, empathy, critical thinking.
Those human elements.
Exactly. Or maybe, just maybe, it's about finding fulfillment and purpose outside of those traditional work structures altogether. It's about broadening our definition of what's possible.
It's about shaping the future, rather than simply reacting to it. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I think it's safe to say that we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of this occupational singularity and what it means for all of us. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's this. The future is not predetermined. We have a choice in how this unfolds. And by understanding the forces at play, by having these conversations, by being proactive in shaping the future of work, we can create a future that benefits everyone.